Good morning, everyone. Will the Standing Committee on Crown Corporations please come to order? Before the committee can proceed with the business before it, it must elect a chairperson. Are there any nominations? Ms. Morley-Lacombe?
I elect or nominate Dennis Smook.
Mr. Smook has been nominated. Any further nominations? Hearing none, Mr. Smook, please take the chair.
Good morning. Our next item of business is the election of a vice chairperson. Are there any nominations? The Honourable Mr. Gertson.
It would be my honor to nominate MLA Morley-Lacombe.
MLA Morley-Lacombe has been nominated. Are there any other nominations? Hearing no other nominations, Ms. Morley-Lacombe is elected vice chairperson. This meeting has been called to consider the annual report of the Manitoba Public Insurance Corporation for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2022. Are there any suggestions from the committee as to how long we should sit? The Honourable Mr. Gertson.
I had a brief discussion this morning with my friend from the opposition. I think we're suggesting 2 hours, and we're committing to be brief in our opening statements.
It has been proposed that we sit for 2 hours. Is that agreeable? Agreed. We will sit for 2 hours this morning. Does the Honourable Minister wish to make an opening statement, and would he please introduce the officials in attendance? The Honourable Mr. Gertson.
It's my pleasure to introduce our CEO, Eric Herbelin, from Manitoba Public Insurance. Eric is not a stranger to this committee at this stage, and I know he's well respected and regarded for the work that he's doing. Certainly all the communications that I have with individuals in the community who are dealing with the MPI speak very highly of his demeanor and his capabilities. I'll let him introduce as we go along staff that are, I think, virtual and not in the room. But I do want to, by extension, thank all the staff at MPI and those who are helping ensure that Manitobans are getting the insurance that they need for their vehicles and other products.
We thank the Honourable Minister for his statement. Does the critic from the official opposition have an opening statement? Yes, Mr. Sandhu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to join you today. Pleased to have the opportunity to talk about Manitoba Public Insurance. There are a few pressing things going on at MPI that I would like to discuss. Of course, recently we saw Project Nova increase in cost. Originally it was 85 million. Now it is estimated to cost up to 289 million. I would like to an accounting for that increase. I would also like to know what is going on at the city place and the facility there. A recent court outcome means that MPI need to change its model of increase from one based on the registered owner to a primary driver model. I would like to hear more about this, and we did discuss this last Monday. I also have some question about recent legislation changes, road safety, MPI investment, and drivers education. And I also like to thank the MPI, Mr. Herbelin, and the staff from MPI for giving me like 3-4 updates recently within the last couple months. For that, thank you very much. Thank you.
We thank the Honourable Member for his statement. Does the Does the representative from the Manitoba Public Insurance Corporation wish to make a statement? Mr. Herbelin?
Yes.
Mr. Herbelin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm joined today by your board chair, Dr. Michael Sullivan, who's joining remotely. Opening remarks from me would be to start with a land acknowledgement and acknowledging that we are gathered on Treaty 1 territory and that MPI operates on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dini peoples, and on the homeland of the Red River Métis. We are reviewing the fiscal year 21-22. During that fiscal year, we achieved a rate decrease of 1.6%. We provided additional rebates of $312 million to Manitobans, totaling nearly $500 million throughout the pandemic. We had one of probably the toughest winter that Manitobans recall, and despite that, we were able to post a $98.3 million net income before rebate, which was above our target of $84.4 million. Our revenue also, in terms of our net earned premiums, increased to $1,420.8 million, exceeding our target of $1,396.1 million. The claims activity was lower than budget, mainly due to COVID, but we also were impacted by some adverse development in terms of investment income and inflation, which affected our results towards the end of the year. The total return of investments was 0.56% instead of a 3.97 target, due mainly to increasing rates out there. And while this had a negative short-term impact, increasing interest rates is a welcome news for the future. In terms of our rates, MPI continue to offer some of the cheapest rates across Canada, and we are pleased that we are ranking the #1 province across the country in terms of lowest rate increases in a cumulative fashion over the last 20 years. Our operating expenses of 23% were below target of 24.5%, and some investments in our operating expenses and activities are needed to going forward to modernize MPI and better meet the service delivery standards. Of note is the employee engagement that went up to 81% from 71% previously. This is my opening remarks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Hervelin, could you please introduce the rest of your staff? I believe whoever's on. Oh, yeah, he already has. Okay. Okay. Well, we thank you for your comments. The floor is now open for questions. Mr. Sandhu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Herblin, thanks for that update. I want to go right into the recent legislation that has been introduced, as I think it's called the BITSA. And we know BITSA this year made changes so that in order to issue a rebate to ratepayers, changes have to be made through legislation rather than through regulation. Was this something MPI requested?
Mr. Hervelin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. MPI, over the last couple of years, has made a couple of changes in terms of managing its capital, going from not having any policies in terms of capital management to a capital management policy that defined a target to meet minimal capital test standards as per OSFI definition. For the basic line of business, that target was set at 100% as a minimum. And in terms of evolving this practice to an industry best practice, MPI suggested to move from a single point to a range, which is very much how all insurance companies out there are managing capital.
Mr. Sandhu.
So this was the requested by MPI to do these, make these changes.
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yes, management proposed the introduction of a range from 100 to 120% to manage capital for the basic line of business to the board of directors of MPI. The board of directors approved that, and in discussions with government, the decision was made to introduce that new legislation.
Mr. Sandhu, just to remind you, when you're ready to speak, please raise your hand so that I have a direct signal to turn on the mics. Mr. Sandhu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. BITSA also changed how much money MPI can hold in a reserve so that hundreds of millions more can be held without having to seek approval of the Public Utility Board. Was this, we know this is requested by MPI. Why was this requested by MPI?
Mr. Herblin?
The reason for the introduction of the range is the adoption of industry best practice so that MPI can really adopt the way that insurance companies are managed. What it does is provide a protection for the ratepayer, protection that the corporation cannot rebate any amount of excess capital below the 100% threshold. What we know as well is that insurance business, per definition, is uncertain in terms of its outcome. It's predictable, but it's uncertain, so therefore there is volatility. We have seen with a tough winter or the introduction of higher interest rates by the Bank of Canada or the inflation that is affecting all of us, the result can move up or down. And so a range allows the corporation to absorb that volatility, but also makes sure that when we reach the upper level of the range, there's an opportunity to rebate. That opportunity to rebate was not existent in the past. Before COVID, it was not possible for the corporation to provide rebates to Manitobans.
Mr. Vassilia?
I'm wondering if you could expand on the rationale for this change, because you said that this was an industry standard. Well, MPI is a Crown corporation. It's not a privately held corporation. It doesn't have shareholders other than the people of Manitoba. So by virtue of its corporate structure, it has a very different risk profile than a private company would have. So given that distinction, why would you adopt private corporate sort of thresholds as opposed to recognizing that MPI is not going to go bankrupt and it has the security of government backing it?
Mr. Herblin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the comment. We are recognizing the fact that MPI is a Crown corporation operating in a compulsory, mandatory type of market. Therefore, we are not adopting the thresholds of public of private insurance companies. If we were to do so, we would not choose a threshold or a range between 100 and 120%. Would probably be rather closer to 200%. So that is definitely factored in the business model. But the introduction of a range is really helping to absorb volatility and avoid the difficulty of targeting 100%. What may happen is that you target 100%, and then there's a little bit of inflation or a little bit more claims in the winter, and you end up having an MCT under 100%, and that automatically should trigger a request for rate increase. So with the opportunity of having the liberty to managing within the range, these kind of effects can be eliminated.
Mr. Sandhu?
Well, what we have heard so far regarding this, and can I maybe just go back, if it were to, this legislation has been intact before, let's say 20, because there was a couple of rebates were given last year. I think 322 million to be exact. If this was legislation was there shouldn't have been any rebate at all.
Mr. Herblin?
So Chair, I think I understand the question, but I would ask the colleague of the opposition to precise whether my understanding is correct. I think what I understood is that MPI rebated money surplus capital to Manitobans in 3 instances last year of 312 million, and that we had not a legislation supporting that or that new legislation allowing that. So I would like to answer the following is that it's true that rebating was not in the legislation and therefore impairing MPI from doing such things. However, during the pandemic, under the special regulations or special rules that during the pandemic, we were able through alignment with government and application to PUB to provide those rebates in exceptional circumstances.
Mr. Sandhu.
What I was asking is, right, if this BITSA was to be enforced at that time, the MP had no way of issuing checks back to ratepayers in, let's say, December 30th, 2021. Is that correct?
Mr. Herblin.
Subject to check in terms of the numbers at the dates that you are providing, Mr. Sandhu. We would have been in the position of returning the excess capital to Manitobans. My assumption being that at very point in time, our MCT was above 120%.
Mr. Sandhu.
How about then in May 2020 and or December 2020, when a rebate of 110 and 69 million were given out? If the BITSA were to be enforced at that time, so there should have been no rebates going to the ratepayers at that time.
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Subject to check again in terms of the exact date and exact MCT levels. If we look at it from a more global perspective, entering into the pandemic, claims levels reduced significantly. MPI immediately generated significant excess of reserves on the basic line of business, and on that basis would have exceeded the 120% MCT very quickly and would have been in a position to providing relief in terms of rebate.
Mr. Sandhu.
If that were to be the case, if it was above 120%, do you still need the permission from the government to go to pub to ask to see if they can provide the rebates?
Mr. Herblin.
Rebates are subject to application to PUB and approval by PUB. We don't have the authority to release rebates just on our own.
Mr. Sandhu.
Thanks, Mr. Herblin. I'd just like to talk about Project Nova at this time. At our last meeting in January, and the CEO explained that Project Nova was off track and off budget, expanding from 3-year long project to 5-year or more long project. And the cost have increased from 85 million in 2019 to more than 150 million in January 10, 2020, and now to over $289 million. A briefing note from the minister said that Nova failed to account for the upstream and downstream work. I have several questions on that one. What is the current budget for Project Nova? What is the contingency?
Contingency.
Contingency. So what is the contingency?
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will ask the leader of the opposition to ask further questions if they would require further details. But I start by simply providing the following information. The initial Nova budget was put together with the help of external consultants many years ago. What they looked at was only some aspects of Nova and probably missed a few points or were not asked the right questions to providing the full scope. We started developing or implementing the program Nova 2 years ago, and relatively soon we realized two things. One is that a number of the cost items were not captured in the initial budget, point one. Point two, the pace at which MPI would need to deliver in terms of the program, the velocity was not achievable, mainly due to MPI's lack of maturity in delivering such programs. In other words, MPI never had the chance to tackle such large project and was not ready to deliver at the pace needed. Therefore, two things needed to happen, which were completed through a thorough internal and external review, which was happening as we had the committee last year, and we could not comment on it because we did not have the results. The two things that needed to happen is, one, account for those cost items that were not covered in the initial budget, and second, to de-risk the program, moving from a 3-year program to a 5-year program, and as a result, extending the time and the use of resources and the cost. The cost in itself was also benchmarked against the cost of such project that happened in the past at other corporations of the size of MPI or comparable activity, and the 280 or 90 million, including contingency, is therefore within that ballpark.
Mr. Sandhu.
So 289 million, is that the final cost, or is that, can we just still estimated cost so far?
Mr. Herblin.
It is our best estimate of the total costs. What happens in such large programs that involve several systems and multi-year implementations with a lot of complexity, internal and external resources, is that there's a lot of unknown. Program Nova was conceived with 4 different phases. Phase 1, or release 1, looking after the release of SRE system for the SRE customers and SRE brokers. The second phase is looking at international registration plan, a different platform, but serving the same type of customers, commercial, large commercial customers. Release 3 and 4 are those phases of the program that will benefit citizen Manitobans in terms of their ability to register their vehicle, to obtain a driver's license, to insure their vehicle, and also to making covering all the aspects of claims. We are very close to releasing the first release, which will be done in the first quarter of next year. And we are very confident about the result of that. So we know exactly, very precisely, what the cost of that first part out of 4 is. The second one will be released in late summer of next year. And we have a good understanding of the costs, and there's minimal risk associated to that. So we can say that roughly half of the program is well underway, and we have a very solid understanding of the release dates, the costs, and what is happening after that. For the second part, the release 3 and release 4, we have to first go through a so-called pre-discovery and discovery event that is basically helping us understanding and defining the scope and the interdependencies to those releases. This will happen in the first month of 2023, starting in January and going through early summer. And once we have completed that, we will have a much higher degree of certainty about the total cost of release 3 and release 4 and what that means for the total budget. As we stand today, MPI has a good degree of comfort about the total cost, and that's best estimate cost of $289 or $290 million.
Mr. Sandhu.
I know so far there were 3 consultants were hired. To your best guesses, do you think we need another consultant for any further upgrade to this system? Do we need another consultant to be hired for any future changes?
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There is a number of different activities going on with NOVA. Some of these activities are being delivered through our staff. Some activities are delivered through contractors that MPI is hiring to complement the staff and the capabilities that we don't have. Some of those activities are provided by the system vendors, as well as so-called system integrators that help us configure the systems that we are purchasing. So there's a bunch of different parties that are involved. We also currently have the support of a consultant to help us manage the program and making sure that we are on the best path for success. This is not going to last forever, but we are definitely considering at this point in time for the start of release 3 and release 4 of the program to work with not only the system vendors and the system integrators, but also a party that can help us coordinate the different parts. The best way to think about it is imagine the construction of a building where you have different trades that are involved, and typically you would have a general contractor that comes in and coordinates those different efforts. This is something that we can use as a reference or an analogy in terms of what is needed going forward. All of that, though, is included in our best estimate costs of $290 million.
Mr. Sandhu.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. A briefing note from the minister say that original estimate for the project Nova Arcot failed to account for upstream and downstream readiness work. Would that include cost for the brokers to establish new program, training their staff, etc.?
Mr. Herblin.
Mr. Chair, I would kindly ask Mr. Sandhu to repeat the question. I didn't get completely.
Mr. Sandhu?
In brief, if I ask, is it any of the cost to train the staff at the brokers will be beared by MPI, or is it broker's cost?
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Sandhu. What we are doing is basically we are implementing new technology. Two aspects of the new technology. One is really replacing the old systems that are outdated, that are not meeting industry standards in terms of risk management and security. And for the brokers, while the system will be new, the processes in themselves will not be new. This will be very much the same as what they've been doing for years and decades. So there is no significant needs in terms of training broker staff. Of course, MPI will provide all the training needed, will pay for the training, and will make sure that MPI is available at any point in time through the hotline, which we are doing already today, so that is not changing. The second aspect of our investments is related to enabling online services or self-serve capabilities for Manitobans, and that is not affecting the ability for brokers to serve Manitobans in person or through the phone directly.
Mr. Sandhu.
So for training to the new system, the brokers will not bear any cost at all.
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It might be a little bit of a strong statement that the brokers will not bear any costs. There might be some costs associated, but I would qualify that as being minimal and part of business as usual. There might be costs related to providing additional support to a colleague who may not immediately understand the system in spite of MPI providing training. That could happen, but I don't see that there would be significant cost added to the broker channel in regards to replacing the systems or introducing Nova at the broker place of work.
Mr. Sandhu.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. An agreement last year gave insurance broker a percentage of the revenue of direct renewal done online and not through the brokers. Would it not make sense that brokers share some of their ever increasing costs for the training to the staff instead of MPI bearing those costs?
Mr. Herblin. Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've had a lot of discussions going on with the brokers in terms of what is right and what is just and fair. We have agreed on new commissioning rates for the brokers, both for in-person transactions and online transactions. Overall, as online adoption will grow eventually, the broker revenues and ability to finance their own costs is expected to decrease. Of course, we need first to go online. We need to see some adoption by Manitobans. The adoption rate will be really driving the difference, whether if there is low adoption rate, brokers will not see much of a change. If there is a significant adoption rate, brokers will pay a cost to that as a natural evolution of how we transact. So I would say there's a lot of unknowns at this point. I think the next couple of years, next 3 to 5 years, will tell us a little bit more in terms of how much Manitobans will enjoy going online, how much they still want to have a broker support, whether they went online or not. I may, for example, go online to change an address, but I still want to visit the broker if I'm changing vehicle. I think the behaviors and adoption of those services will be very individual. Each person will probably have some different views on that. And as MPI, we need to make sure that we provide the best service and access to insurance and service to all Manitobans, whether they have access to internet, whether they want to go through that, or whether they need the help and support of a broker in person.
Mr. Sandhu.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Recently, the new contract we signed with the brokers has given them some extra percentage of the share through if somebody go through the brokers. Because this project is now, instead of being done within 2 years, is 5 years plus. This is costing ratepayers more to go through the brokers because we are giving them, with the new contract, the bigger percentage of the share?
Mr. Herblin.
So the short and long of it is no, for the simple reason that we agreed with the brokers to make a change to the commission rates between in-person and online only when MPI will be ready to go online. So as we speak, MPI and the broker community are discussing a change to the agreement that was signed, making sure that we are not doing what you exactly described, Mr. Sandhu, and don't pay more than we would otherwise. So be rest assured that the change in commissions will be aligned with the moment when MPI is ready to go online, whether we have a delay or not.
Mr. Sandhu.
Can the CEO maybe update a little bit more as he just explained that they're going, they're in discussion with the brokers, what they're discussing in brokers regarding what new online services, or because the project is delayed regarding that one?
Mr. Herblin.
So MPI and brokers agreed to make a change to the commission rate the moment that MPI would start providing online services. The change is basically moving from one rate to 2 different rates, one for in-person transaction and one for online transaction. And the difference between the two is significant. The in-person transaction commission rate is slightly above the current rate, but the online is much, much reduced. We had agreed to make that transition at a set date, anticipating that Nova would provide online services at a defined date. We were probably a little bit too sure of our ability to deliver on time. Now that we know we will have some delays on the delivery and not necessarily know a precise date today, we are adjusting the contract with language saying that the existing rates will remain in force up until the moment MPI is able to switch on the online services at any point in time in the future. So, and even if that, for whatever reason, would not happen, we would maintain the current rate. So there's a certainty that brokers will not be able to get higher commissions before we are going online with the self-serve capability.
Mr. Sandhu.
I know this may be confidential, but I really want to know what is the response from the broker so far regarding this.
Mr. Herblin.
The response from brokers is very good. Collaboration is excellent. We are in a very positive mindset, both sides. Both parties want to do the right thing. I think brokers understand that this is not something they can try and get around. And I would provide additional certainty, Mr. Sandhu, that the brokers did put that on the record at PUB, so we are completely aligned on that.
Mr. Sandhu.
Earlier, I think the last answer you have given me is there was a set date that the project Nova was supposed to be online. Can you provide me that set date was?
Mr. Herblin.
So for the first release, we are looking at January the 23rd of next year for the release 2. So the first release is addressing the needs of SRE brokers and customers. For the release 2, which is addressing the needs of international registration plan users, our target release date is the end of August of 2023. For the release 3 and 4, initially the project was conceived in a way that we would deliver a so-called Big Bang delivery. We would develop and configure all the system requirements for a number of months or years, and on a single day we would switch on and magic would happen. There's a lot of risk associated in that type of approach, and we have been advised to change our delivery mode from a Big Bang approach to a series of smaller releases of packages. We have defined what those release objectives are. There are many. There are several dozens of them. And the order of these different release objectives has not been completely finalized yet. For that, we first need to go through what I mentioned before, the pre-discovery and discovery exercises that will tell us and inform us about prerequisites. Will inform in terms of the exact scope, the complexity associated, different integrations, data requirements, security requirements, and more and more. And based on all these aspects, as well as the complexity and the value to Manitobans, there will be sort of a prioritization model defined and put in place, such that we will deliver smaller components of Nova on an ongoing basis for a number of years. The first part of that release 3 and then release 4 aspects, for the first couple of months will be more technical foundations. It will not be a use case for the employee, the broker, or the consumer, the Manitoba citizen. But as we build those foundations, we will start building the products and the processes and services that will be introduced to our internal users, the brokers, and at some point, our external consumers.
Mr. Sandhu.
Thanks for those answers, Mr. CEO. And can you please just, for the record, to best of your guess, when will be the last releasing date of Project Nova? So the final, best guess. I'm sure you probably have a discussion with the team that this we are going, let's say 2025, 2026. something in your mind or not in your mind, actually, with talking with your team, what is the best guess you have it so far that the final release will be?
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sandhu, I need to use caution and not overpromise here, because unless we go through the so-called pre-discovery and discovery exercise, we don't have full certainty and full vision or understanding of the complexity. But at this point in time, we are budgeting the spend of NOVA through the fiscal 25-26. So that would be another 3 years, roughly. So if you ask for a high level direction, this is roughly 3+ years.
Mr. Sandhu.
So what was the initial date of final release?
Mr. Herblin.
As I mentioned, the initial plan was certainly ambitious and lacking a number of information and considerations. So we cannot really compare, but it's really moving from a 3 to 5+ year program time horizon.
Mr. Sandhu.
Was there a set year, month, date was in plan?
Mr. Herblin.
Mr. Chair, may I kindly ask Mr. Sandhu to repeat that?
Mr. Sandhu.
So I was just wondering, for the initial release date, was there a set year, month, and date was in plan?
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the initial plan, there was a set date, a precise date, which was expecting us to see the initial online services for Release 3 to be available to Manitobans on an April 1st date. And if I'm not mistaken, this will happen the year 2023. But again, as I look back now, we've been 2 years in the works of implementing NOVA. We clearly and rapidly understood that the initial plan was not realistic and not reasonable for a number of reasons, and therefore we had to adjust our delivery approach and our timelines.
Mr. Sandhu.
Maybe we can just go to some other questions on Project NOVA. On page 31 of the estimate book, it says that department spent $87,344 million in 2022-23 and $64,346 million in 2021-22 on the, I will quote, the acquisition of assets MPI. This is on page 31. The explanatory note states that this money was for City Place and Project NOVA. Can MPI provide breakdown of how much of this money was for City Place and how much money was for Project NOVA?
Mr. Hamblin.
Thank you for the question, and Mr. Sandhu may want to ask me follow-up questions if I'm not meaning exact numbers that is referring to have our internal numbers, and I'm not sure they match up exactly the reference he's having. But so from a NOVA perspective, if I look at the capital expenditures from an estimate perspective, for 22-23, we have a total of 49 million. For 23-24, we have a total of 61.7 million. On the City Place aspect, For 22-23, we have a 12.4 million, and for 23-24, we have 5.8 million. And that is precise that the CD place is really related to our space plan investment, and we might have a number of other capital expenditures that are related more to the ongoing operations and fit up of the building.
Mr. Sandhu.
Sorry, can you, I didn't get it. Can you explain what the money was spent on City Place was for, like, because it's sitting empty, or was it maintenance, or what the money was spent on?
Mr. Herblin.
Certainly. So for the year 22-23, we have a spend of $12.4 million that is related to the remodeling of our space plan. So basically looking at the spaces in the office tower occupied by MPI, and the focus is on 2 floors, 8th floor and 9th floor. And it's basically the transformation of that environment that was outdated and provide a new modern dynamic workplace environment for MPI staff. It was 12.4 million in 22-23 and 5.8 million budgeted for 23-24.
Mr. Sandhu.
How many people are working at 234 Donald Street, which is City Place? How many people are working in there now, and how many people are working from home?
Mr. Herblin.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have the precise number, Mr. Sandhu, and we might have to follow up if you want further details. In principle, we have several hundred of people who are assigned to City Place. And these numbers have not changed significantly before COVID or now after COVID. What has changed, though, is the place from which people are working. We no longer have everyone come to the office every day. We have a flexible work program in place, and we are trying to get people back to the location. And this City Place modernization of our environment that I mentioned completed in the summer of 2022 for the 9th floor, and is underway for the 8th floor. And we still have a number of people located on the 7th floor, but we have some transitions happening. So because of that, we have not reached the full capacity in terms of occupation of the building just yet. That is a transition, but we have observed an increase in terms of occupancy from the summer to now, and we expect that this will continue and increase over time. As a result, though, we are generating some operational efficiencies, because not having everyone every day in the building has allowed us to lease a number of floors and to lease those floors out to tenants who are paying a rent and helping us making City Place an attractive investment.
Mr. Sandhu.
I just heard that so maybe we can lease more of City Place to people who want to move in. Can you maybe just explain what percentage of the City Place is sitting empty right now, and what percentage of is being leased?
Mr. Herblin.
So we should look at City Place in 2 parts. One is the retail, the first 2 floors, and the office tower. In terms of the office tower, MPI is occupying the 9th floor, is now renewing the 8th floor, and we still have a number of people on the 7th floor. All of the rest of the office tower is completely leased out, so we don't have any empty space. As far as the retail environment, I would say that we are on a transition phase. Most of the space is occupied, with exception of a larger portion on the main floor. And we are currently looking at options to attracting anchor tenants for that part of the building.
Mr. Sandhu.
So what percentage is empty right now?
Mr. Herblin.
For the retail space, I would say it's roughly 30%.
Mr. Sandhu.
Is City Place losing money or making money? Simple.
Mr. Herblin.
Short answer is we are not losing money, we are making money. If you want further details, we'll be happy to follow up on that.
Mr. Sandhu.
Thank you, Mr. Herblin, for that answer. On page 23, the MPI annual report, it states that the key outcome of Project Nova include, I quote, positioning MPI to be better equipped to implement new legislation and offer new services. Can you please outline an example of what this new legislation or new services are?
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not prepared to answer that question in detail. I believe mention is made to some of the legislation that recently passed, 14, and there are 14 different items that are helping us, enable some of those services through the changes brought by Nova. If there's anything specific on that, Mr. Sandhu, I would have probably to take it away.
Mr. Sandhu.
Mr. Herblin, through the chair to Mr. Herblin, this is on page 23, and it is saying that MPI is better equipped to implement new legislation. So that means this is related to only Bill 14, or was there any other services that were we offered through this new legislation? So can you explain what are those services are? Like, is there any services that, can you just provide some examples?
Mr. Herblin. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, we'll be happy to follow up with further details, Mr. Sandhu, but examples that are being new is around IRP legislation or new vital statistic changes.
Mr. Sandhu.
Maybe I'm gonna just briefly go into a online auction for MPI, which is I think it's Impact Auto Auction is right now doing auctioning in behalf of MPI. But this new project Nova, can those services be provided by in-house by MPI, such as what Impact Auto Auction is doing right now?
Mr. Herblin.
Mr. Chair, I would kindly ask Mr. Sandhu to precise or repeat the point. I could not fully appreciate the question.
Mr. Sandhu.
Okay, MPI recently, I think a couple years back, signed a contract with Impact Auto Auctioneer to do online auction for, it is written off cars. With Project Nova, those, what is Impact Auto right now provide? Can they be brought in-house, such as maybe MPI can do itself, those auctions, instead of outside someone else is doing those auctions?
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you very much, and I understand the question. So we are talking here about salvage, that is, cars that cannot be repaired and that we indemnify the policyholder for, and that we find the best way possible to sell to recoup some of the cost and minimize the claims cost. In the past, these auctions were finding place in person, and the market that we were able to attract was very much of a local market. Through the introduction of an online auction system, the market that we are able to reach has augmented significantly, and with that, the values on the vehicles have increased significantly as well. It is not so much about the online or the technology, and as such, if it was really just the technology, we could replace that, but it's much more about the market that we are able to access through that. And so Nova will not replace that system in itself, because Nova is not able to create or recreate the market that is entering or that is attending those auctions.
Mr. Sandhu.
I will just, because I just asked the question online services regarding Impact Auto, I probably just keep a couple of questions on that one. We know Impact Auto also charge dealers some fees. They have to register first before you can bid. There's a fees related to that one. And then there's also a fees for an individual person to be part of, you can say membership, pretty much it's a membership you have to buy. Any of that money does MPI get from being those people who are becoming a member of Impact Auto, such as paying $150 or $100 fees?
Mr. Herblin.
I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly. Is the question whether MPI is collecting any of those fees? If that is the case, no, MPI is not collecting those fees.
Mr. Sandhu.
Also, when MPI is selling cars through online auction through Impact Auto, they also, as I said, they charge membership fees, and then they also charge whenever MPI sell any car. If I were to be one of those people who bought the car, I have to pay percentage of the fees to Impact Auto. Is any of that money comes to MPI, or that directly goes to Impact also?
Mr. Herblin.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. MPI is not collecting those fees and not retaining any of that. So really, the net benefit for MPI is only the salvage value, the net salvage value of the vehicle.
Mr. Sandhu.
So considering we signed this contract, probably going from in-house to outside, I don't know how long the contract is with Impact Auto. This was a open tender contract, I know that. And will you change anything come next contract, because the fees they are collecting from people who are buying MPI cars? Can you just maybe elaborate a little bit on this? If you were to issue a new tender, it's going to be something different than what it was earlier.
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The choice for this solution was based on a business case, and we have witnessed, since we are going through that process, significant benefits from greater salvage values. So this is definitely benefiting Manitobans in terms of the net cost of claims. Typically, with all of our partners, we have a tender process, we have a contract that goes for a number of years, and we review those contracts before they expire and make the determination at the time as whether there are better options, potential options. Sometimes we have single source of services, that are operating a very special service, and so there are different situations. But in this case, I believe that every now and then we would take the opportunity to re-tender the contract and see if there is better value, if there are different options available to MPI, and assess those options duly.
Mr. Sandhu.
Last time we talked, I think we were discussing if they have any office in Winnipeg or Manitoba. There was no office, no employee were from Manitoba. Is this still the case? They have no employee or office in Manitoba?
Mr. Herblin.
This group is part of a larger corporation, and they certainly have a subsidiary in Manitoba.
Mr. Sandhu.
Do they have any employees in Manitoba?
Mr. Herblin.
I don't know that precisely, Mr. Sandhu, but I would be happy to check and get back to you.
Mr. Sandhu.
I'd love to get that information to see if they have an office or even if they have any employees in Manitoba here. Now, maybe just to go, I think we did talk last Monday, but for the record, for the people, for Manitobans to know, I really want to know about the court case you probably heard. That were MPI recently lost a court challenge with the FAB regarding to how insurance premiums are set. Currently, it is based on a registered owner. FAB ordered MPI to move to primary driver model. What is the impact of this decision?
Mr. Herblin.
Our understanding of this decision is that MPI is now mandated to explore the primary driver model to understand the benefits, potential challenges related to the model, and what would it take for MPI to implement that model going forward. So this is very much what the corporation is going to do, research and understanding and analysis. And the first step, go back to PUB to present the findings and discuss the findings and follow the direction set by PUB in that regard.
Mr. Sandhu.
Is there a set date when the MPI have to respond to PUB to provide the analysis on this? How will this have impact and when this will be implemented?
Mr. Herblin.
We will bring our findings, whatever findings we have in that time, to the next application and hearing process.
I'd just like to remind the member that this committee is to do with the annual report. The question should be for the annual report, just to remind you. Mr. Sandhu.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, for the clarification. Does the CEO have an estimate of cost of transition from the current model to if it were to be implemented as directed by the courts?
Mr. Herblin.
I believe the member is asking if we understand the cost of transitioning from the registered owner to the primary driver model, and short answer is no. At this point, we don't know what it would mean from an effort perspective, from a cost perspective.
Mr. Sandhu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In July, a black driver reported they could not get their license because MPI system was recording color as unnatural. An MPI spokesperson later explained that it was the overall color of the picture that caused the error. Can the CEO explain what the issue is here and what they have done to fix it?
I'd just like to remind the member that you should be asking questions on the annual report. Those types of questions are really not in the annual report. So, yeah, if you could tie it back someplace there, that would be greatly appreciated. Mr. Sandhu. Mr. Vassiliou? Mr. Vassiliou.
Okay, well, I think with the greatest respect, we're talking about a technological failure which would fall under the purview of the annual report. So I think it very much is a relevant question. I'm very interested in hearing what Mr. Hamlin has to say about it.
I still believe that should be in the annual report. It may be tied back in the way, but it's up to Mr. Hamlin if he's. The Honorable Mr. Gertson?
It was a very specific question that felt more sort of like case specific or maybe kind of a question per question. But so I don't think that Mr. Washley is trying to challenge the chair, or I hope that he's not trying to challenge the chair. Perhaps a question that's that specific, Mr. Hamlin could take under advisement and see what information he could provide in the future.
Mr. Hamlin?
So I'm happy to answer in generic terms and not comment on a specific case, but I think the technology we are referring to is not technology that is proprietary to MPI. We are using a vendor technology. This is supposed to be providing the service expected in all circumstances for the process that it's actually supporting. Whenever a mistake happens, this is always something very painful and personable and regretful. The measures we've taken is to immediately respond individually to the case in consideration, but also generally with the software company, and making sure that this problem can A, be fixed, and second, also that the procedures and the consequences of whenever this would happen are being improved as experienced, and the messages provided were not appropriate in that instance.
Mr. Sandhu?
Is this message also being shared with the current Project Nova team when they're looking into the system, that this happened in previous system, but it won't happen in the new system?
Mr. Herblin?
This is not related to Nova. We need systems for different things. This is one aspect of the process that we need to perform that Nova will not be changing or replacing in itself. However, having said that, as I said, we've immediately contacted the vendor of that solution, making sure that this would not happen in the future. Whenever this would ever happen, the procedures in place would be appropriate to respond to such situations.
Mr. Sandhu?
On page 12, it said that MPI paid $23 million to Manitoba medical practitioner on behalf of customers. Can MPI provide a breakdown of what medical practitioner were compensated? Easy example, X amount was physiotherapy, etc.
Mr. Mr. Herblin?
I will have to take that under advisement. I don't have the.
Mr. Sandhu?
Can MPI explain why the driver education program spending increased from 1.595 million in 2021 to 3.563 million in 2022? This is on page 70 annual report.
Mr. Herblin.
I think I will add that to the list of things to take under advisement, if you don't mind. I don't have the details available on this.
Mr. Sandhu.
Can I just go to maybe fraud and theft? How is impacting MPI? How many fraudulent claim did MPI receive in 2021, 22?
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for those questions. I don't have all these details available just here, so I will take that question under advisement and we'll get back to you.
Mr. Sandhu.
Maybe this probably be another one where it will go under advisement, but for the record, I do like to put it on the record. How many theft claim did MPI receive in 2021, 22?
The Honorable Mr. Herblin. Mr. Herblin.
I will take that question under advisement.
Mr. Sandhu.
Maybe this is probably the real question. Why did MPI stop including this data in their annual report? Why it's not on the annual report?
Mr. Herblin.
Chair, and I appreciate the comment. We're always looking for feedback and ways to improve, so we'll take that away as a good input.
Mr. Sandhu.
To my understanding, it was there earlier, and maybe just want to know, maybe Minister knows or maybe President know why this was taken out of the report.
Mr. Herblin.
There was certainly no intention to hide any information. One of our motto is transparency and provide as much transparency as possible. So if this has disappeared, I'm not necessarily mindful, aware of that. And there was no, maybe only I can only think that there was a willingness to try and make the information as succinct and accessible to all readers. But again, if that is something that is missing and should be there, we will take it away and consider that for future reports.
Mr. Sandhu.
In October of this year alone, there was a span of 2 weeks where 5 pedestrians in Winnipeg were hit by vehicle, with 3 of those incidents being fatal. 2 were hit and run. What does MPI believe to be done to improve road safety?
Mr. Herblin.
These are always tragic events, and we are taking road safety at heart, really. We have developed articulated a new road safety strategy, and that some aspects of the strategy is really to look into data points and identify the causes of the most dramatic injuries and fatalities on the roads and understand those causes. So MPI is not in a position necessarily to to avoid those accidents, but with the data, it is our role to provide insights to the various road safety and road safety enforcement agencies. So we provide the data and make sure that the various stakeholders are being made aware of the areas that can benefit the most from actions.
Mr. Sandhu.
Thank you, Mr. Herblin, for providing that information. Has MPI had a recent discussion with the province and the city of Winnipeg, or what can be done? Is there any discussion with the city of Winnipeg on this?
Mr. Herblin.
We are engaging on a regular basis with the various stakeholders, including the City of Winnipeg and Police of Winnipeg. So yes, we are actively discussing those aspects related to road safety with all relevant key stakeholders.
Mr. Sandhu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Regarding MPI's investment portfolio, does MPI have any holding in cryptocurrencies?
Mr. Herblin.
No, we don't.
Mr. Sandhu.
What is the current backlog for driver ed test broken out by class 1 to 5?
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I mentioned in my opening remarks that we needed to make some investments in the business in terms of adding staff. As post-pandemic, we've been taken a little bit by surprise in terms of the number of citizens who need our services, and there's also a backlog that was creating during the pandemic, especially as it relates to driver testing. So specifically in terms of classified road tests, we currently have a wait time of up to 150 days. Doesn't mean that someone is not able to get an appointment before, but it can take up to 150 days. And our target is to reduce that to a maximum of 45 days immediately over time to make that wait even shorter. In terms of class 1, the wait time is up to 60 days today, and we would like to reach a 14-day average in short order.
Mr. Sandhu.
I know recently I have discussed some of this with the class 1 driving schools. There are certain number of spots are given to the people who go through a provincial funded program. I think 2 tests are given to those people. Is there any plan of changing any of this for people to allow, instead of booking one person for 2 exams and then allowing open like other people to do the exams?
Mr. Hamlin.
Thank you.
Sorry, Herblin.
Thank you for the question, and we are well aware of these concerns. We are in advanced discussions with the industry to find ways to provide advanced booking for all. We have not come to a concrete outcomes just yet, but we are aware of it, mindful of it, working on it.
Mr. Sandhu.
Thank you for that, Mr. Herblin. And there's also, I had discussion with the people who were looking to do tests. I just want to know, maybe this may be under advisement, but there's certain class 1 driving tests used to be broken into a different parts, such as backing up the truck and all those things. I think there were 4 different way of doing it. Now it is all one. If you fail one, even though if you pass the first part, then you fail the next part, then next test you have to start from the beginning again. Is there discussion of breaking this into a different part, such as driving, backing up, and doing a test, like safety test or something?
Again, Mr. Sandhu, if you could sort of tie it back somehow to the annual report, because it's really.
It might be a good general question, but
yeah, we need to have it tied back to the. Mr. Herblin,
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will take that question under advisement.
Mr. Sandhu,
Okay, is there anything in this annual report I can say where in class 1 it says, no, not class 1, actually class 5, any study done where it can be broken into 2 parts, where people doing parallel parking and then people doing road test. On the parallel parking, somebody passes it and then fails on the driving, and the next time around, they still have to start from the beginning. Next time they comes in, they will fail on their parallel parking, and they won't even go further than that. What are those times?
You're gonna have to tie back to the report.
yeah,
You just have to rephrase the question.
Mr. Sandhu, we'll have to ask you to rephrase the question so it is tied back, because I don't believe that is in the annual report, but if you can figure out a way to tie it back, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I was just wondering if this is
Mr. Sandhu?
Just wondering if this was in their annual report to making a driving license changes, road test changes.
Mr. Herblin?
We don't cover that in our annual report, but Mr. Sandhu, we have an open dialogue. We'll be happy to follow up with you outside of the committee, if you don't mind.
Mr. Vassiliou?
A few questions in regard to the First Nations Injury Prevention Program. What is it and when was it established?
It's the nature of this committee. We haven't changed.
Mr. Herblin?
Thank you for the question. In terms of First Nation engagement, we are making sure that we work with these communities from a road safety perspective mainly. As we understand, there are higher incidents of injuries in those communities. We understand as well that the best outcomes are likely to come from a collaboration standpoint with the First Nations, so that we can identify and execute on ways to preventing injuries in a way that correspond to the local environment and can be accepted by those communities. And that is the main focus that MPI has in this regard.
Mr. Vassiliou?
What are the plans and objectives of this program?
Mr. Herblin?
Main objective is to reduce the number of serious injuries and fatalities. And in terms of the plans, this is early days. Main aspects underway currently is engagement to build relationships and provide coordination, support for coordination out of the First Nation communities. I think this is a long-term initiative from MPI that will need to build on a number of developments and execution of those plans. We are at the start of that journey at this point.
Mr. Vassiliou?
So getting back to, I guess, my first question then, when was the program established and do you have any measurable outcomes at this point?
Mr. Herblin?
Program was established during the course of the last fiscal, and at this point in time, we are engaging with First Nations to determine the course of actions and outcomes that we want to achieve together.
Mr. Vassiliou?
Oh, I just want to get back to the reserves. I have a few questions about that. I want to make sure that it's clear in my head. So right now, the ratio is 120%, and I think if I heard you correct, if you were a private company, that ratio should be 200%. I'm just wondering if you confirm, before the legislative changes, the ratio was at 100%? Do I have that correct?
Mr. Herblin.
So the MCT, which is the minimum capital test ratio, that is a metric set by OSFI, the national regulator for companies, insurance companies that are federally regulated, but this is a best practice. So the MCT for the basic line of business was set at 100% and still is at 100% with the new legislation. What has changed is, rather than measuring a single point, the 100%, we have now introduced a range within which we can operate. A range for going from 100% as a minimum and 120% as a target maximum, from which we can consider, or would consider, strongly consider, rebating the excess capital back to Manitobans.
Just to remind everybody, if all questions and comments could come through the chair to make sure that we're staying on that proper format. Mr. Vassiliou.
So why was the old system not working? Why system needing change? And what does the range give us that the previous MCT at 100% didn't?
Mr. Herblin, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The introduction of the 100% as a single point was an improvement compared to what we had in the past. It did at least set a target and a minimum threshold to hit. The MPI business is highly, plannable, predictable in some ways. We know how many cars are being driven on the road. With that, we have a history that is quite predictable in terms of the number of accidents, injuries, and the cost thereof. And with that, we can predict with a degree of confidence the cost of claims in general. But sometimes, you have deviations to that expected result. We have seen in recent past major developments that can affect those in the short term, which might be a pandemic, all of a sudden limiting the number of vehicles on the road and having a significant deviation to the positive. Or we have interest rates rising and at the same time inflation rising and having a double negative effect on our net income. We could have an unplanned natural catastrophe and we buy reinsurance to protect ourselves, but we have, several millions of dollars on our net exposure that we need to pay out in such cases. And the introduction of a range allows us to manage the volatility year over year. And a range of 20% is very minimal when you think about it. Most private insurance companies would go for probably a larger range and certainly a larger threshold to start with. But I think we appreciate the fact that we operate in an environment where we have more control, where there is less risk in terms of the capital, and it felt appropriate at the time of introducing this new proposed legislation that the 100% could remain and the 20% sort of range would allow us to absorb for the volatility over a single year of events.
Mr. Vassiliou.
What's the current ratio right now?
Mr. Herblin.
We measured the ratio on a quarterly basis. At the end of last fiscal, it was at 95, which is close to 100. Through the first quarter and second quarter of this year, I don't have the numbers on top of my head, but the ratio has slightly increased, is above 100%. However, we have some elements that are playing to that equation in terms of inflation and the increase of our reserves due to the inflation. So we are round and about the 100% range. And again, we can look into the annual report or the quarterly reports that were filed at the end of June and at the end of September. I don't have these in front of me, and the MCT ratio would be available on those reports.
Mr. Vasiliou.
So again, so I can wrap my head around this. So I imagine the capital that you have, the excess capital, gets invested into the market. How big is that investment pool?
Mr. Herblin.
So the way our business system functions is that we are collecting premiums before we pay claims and pay our expenses. So the premium collected minus the expected claims and expenses in the current year are invested. And there are two main buckets in terms of our investments that relates to the basic line of business. One is the insurance liabilities. In other words, the claims that have not been fully paid. I'll give you an example. Someone gets injured in a car, is not able to go back to work, is disabled, maybe permanently, will get a weekly indemnity amount as well as personal care support from MPI for a duration of 20, 30, 40 years. We are reserving those amounts or provisioning those amounts, and at the same time investing in mainly fixed income in bonds to make sure that we match our liabilities, those assets with our liabilities. And this is generating, a decent level of income depending on the market conditions. So we mentioned interest rates. When interest rates were low, it would be lower. When they suddenly increase, there's an immediate correction in terms of the asset values. But in the long run, higher paying interest rates are good. And so that's the main part of our investment. Now we have the reserve above and beyond the liabilities. That is basically the capital that we need to hold against the sum of all our risks. There are insurance risk, investment risks. There are also some risk associated to the fact that we bear the employer liability of our pension plan. There are some operational risks that are being accounted for and whatnot. So the sum of the capital, the RSR, is invested in a set of different types of assets as well. The risk we take on the excess capital is slightly bigger than on the liabilities. On liabilities, there's almost zero risk because we want to have a proper match of the assets with the liabilities. And on the other aspects, we follow an investment strategy that is discussed with PUB, that is approved by our board of directors, and that is making sure that we have a sort of a balance between the yield, the revenue we can generate, and the risk that we are taking.
Mr. Vasiliou.
So what's the rate of return on the sort of bond holdings, and then what is the rate of the return on the equity holdings?
Mr. Herblin.
It varies all the time because it's not a simple equation where you just buy, an over-the-counter sort of GIC that pays 1.5, 2, or 3%. The bonds are subject to not only the interest rate on the bond itself, but to the changes in yields, the asset price. That is one thing that changes constantly. We were expecting a return on investment of 4% on the sum of all our investments in the last fiscal. And due to the sudden increase in interest rates, and with that the falling level of asset valuation, we only generated 0.6% roughly. So sometimes it's above expectation, sometimes it's below. The fiscal before that, we had a double-digit total return. Important is that over the long run, we are generating positive yields, it is also important that we maintain that what the so-called asset liability matching between assets and liabilities. That is, when assets are maybe increasing in value, or liabilities are matched according to discount rates than the interest rate level. And when we have situations where the markets are going down, our liabilities can adjust as well, so that overall we are not seeing significant variations of multi-million dollars in the net income of MPI on a year-over-year basis.
Mr. Vasalia.
So when you do have a good year, where you have double-digit profits, do they just get recycled into the fund, or can they be taken out and used for other MPI purposes?
Mr. Herblin.
So there are several components of that. One that is related to our insurance liabilities, that is on the left side of the balance sheet. It's the biggest part of the balance sheet. It's the money that we provision or reserve for payment of, or future payment of claims that happen. And the example of person disabled and that will continue to receive MPI checks for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, whatever that is. On average, we have a claim duration of 10 years. That is, any claim on average lasts 10 years on our books. And that is a consequence, an immediate consequence of the generous PIP program that we have, the personal insurance protection plan that we have. For those liabilities, any movement up or down are immediately seeing the correction or the equivalent movement up or down on the liabilities, because interest rates are linked to the time value of money and the discount rates at which we discount our liabilities. So for that, and that is by far the largest part of our investments, we don't see any consequences in terms of the money being redirected anywhere or not. For the reserve capital, we don't have that asset liability matching mechanism, and so any increase in the capital will have a direct impact in terms of the MCT going up or going down. That is, we have more or less capital available in comparison to the capital that is being required. And that could be an opportunity for MPI if we hit our threshold to return money to Manitobans. In no way would the capital or those surplus excess capital go anywhere but in the form of a rebate to Manitobans or stay in the reserve to absorb the volatility over time.
Mr. Vasalia.
I'm wondering if you could give us an idea of what percentage of the bond holdings are Manitoba provincial sovereign debt or hydro sovereign debt.
Mr. Herblin.
Subject to getting updates on precise numbers, but it's the vast majority provincial bonds, vast majority. We don't have federal governments. The vast majority of our investments are in Manitoba provincial bonds.
Mr. Vasalia.
Now, I think I saw a list a couple of years ago about equity holdings for MPI. And going through the list, I noticed there was a number of fossil fuel companies that MPI invested in. And I'm wondering, is there any sort of ethical investment strategy involved in this? Is there any check or balance about, what companies that MPI is investing in? I'm wondering if you could expand on that.
Mr. Herblin.
I think this is an issue that is becoming more and more part of the way we think and make decisions. Per se, I would say it's a new subject for MPI, but an important one. And I think while we don't have a formal strategy today, we are mindful of where our investments are going. And I could suspect that in the future, we are becoming more and more specific and diligent about that.
Mr. Vasalia.
So I think you told us there was a board of directors that makes these decisions, but there's no formal policy or framework to guide the work of the board. It's all sort of individual board members' views of what investments MPI should undertake.
Mr. Herblin.
We have a very specific investment policy, so it's not to the discretion of board of directors members to steer in one or the other direction. And we have a very robust process that we go through in terms of deciding what part of our portfolio is invested in what kind of asset and in what proportions. Once the strategy is defined, we hire investment managers for the different classes of assets. Those managers are selected based on a strict set of criteria in terms of their performance, the integrity, their reputation and whatnot. And we are reviewing their performance on an ongoing basis. And should a manager not perform over a number of years, we are making decisions to exit those relationships and reallocate our assets to others.
Mr. Vasiliou.
So if I interpret your comments correctly, the main metric would obviously be performance-based, but I take it you can confirm for the committee today that Manitoba currently, MPI currently invests in fossil fuel companies.
Mr. Herblin.
I cannot answer that question for certain. I will take that away as an undertaking, making sure that we provide the transparency.
Mr. Vasiliou.
But there's currently no policy in place that would prevent MPI from investing in fossil fuel companies.
Mr. Herblin.
We'll definitely add that to our answer to provide the full clarity.
Mr. Sandhu.
Yeah, I had just recently just about Project Nova. I know there's new changes are coming with Project Nova. The newcomers, such as visitor to Manitoba, is really hard for them to prove their residency. Is with Bill 14 and with Project Nova, is there any changes that will make it easier for people to prove their residency in Manitoba so they can get a license? This is also related to visitor and permanent residents arriving in Manitoba.
Mr. Herblin.
Yes, so thank you for the question. Indeed, one aspect that will make the process easier is around EVRL. The list of guarantor will be extended.
Oh, sorry. Oh, Mr. Sandhu.
So currently you have to be known the person on a guarantor firm for 2 years. What are the other changes? Because only Manitoba and Alberta allow a visitor to obtain a license. How can they prove their residency in Manitoba? One way to do is providing they needed 2 pieces of Manitoba residence address. How can do that? How can they do that?
Mr. Herbeland.
Thank you. So for visitors to Manitoba, there's an ability to stay and drive in Manitoba for 3 months without having to make any changes, and that will continue, and that offers, I would hope, some good degree of flexibility already. In terms of the guarantors list, it will extend, and so more people will be able to be on the list and provide additional opportunities for resident or for newcomers that decide to become residents to get the support needed in that fashion.
Mr. Sandhu.
Permanent residents arriving in Manitoba, and they also have to prove their residency. One way to do it is obtaining a void check from the bank with the address on it. Sometimes people live with their friends, their family members, and there's no way to obtain the second piece of proving the residency. How can they do it with this new project, Nova?
Mr. Herbeland.
A tough tie.
Yeah, so really, second proof of residence is where the guarantor and the guarantor list come in, and having a larger number of guarantors available will improve access to this aspect that you just mentioned.
Mr. Sandhu.
A grantor is, again, you have to know, you can only sign it after you know that person for 2 years. And there is no way for newcomers to obtain a license quicker, because you will not gonna know for 2 years. Someone, the grantor, there's a specific list on it, such as doctors, MLAs, MPs. You will not gonna know someone for 2 years. So is there a way to make it a little bit easier for newcomers to obtain a license? I know Manitoba Health allow a family member to sign a piece of paper where it says, yes, this person will live with me for at least 6 months. That's how Manitoba Health proves someone's residency. Will MPI consider this also?
Mr. Herbeland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in terms of the question asked, I understand that guarantors would need to know an individual for 2 years with a number of exceptions, but based on that, MPI has an exception process in place that is open to all facing challenges, and that would assist in trying to find additional ways to prove the identity. I am told that this process has been working quite well, and that we would continue doing that.
Mr. Vasiliou.
I have a question about brokerages and whether or not they potentially can cause a risk factor to MTI. There's obviously a growing trend in Manitoba where brokerages are consolidating into bigger and bigger companies, and there is fewer and fewer sort of ma and pa single outlet insurance brokerages. I'm wondering if you can comment on that trend and to see if that will in the future affect MPI operations, where you're not dealing with 120 brokerages anymore, you're dealing with 10, 15 large, many out of province brokerage companies.
Mr. Herblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm aware of the consolidation process happening in the brokerage space. For now, what we are seeing is the change of signs on the front door of locations. We're not seeing a reduction in the number of locations or consolidation at this level. Occasionally, MPI is being asked to consider the transfer of a license attached to a certain location to another location, and we are reluctant to providing that because we always look at whether a given location is serving the needs and making sure that local community is able to access the services, and we want to make sure that as many Manitobans as possible can continue and have services accessible to them, especially outside of Winnipeg. I think in Winnipeg there's more choice, but as soon as we go outside, typically you will find one broker, and that one broker, if they were to all of a sudden disappear, that would cause some disruption in service. So we are acutely following that and making sure that we are not, helping through the consolidation, having a number of locations that would be diminished, and with that services diminished. Having said that, over time, what will it be and what the consequences might be, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but we are very, very aware of that and making sure, to the extent we can, that brokers continue and operate in all parts of Manitoba.
Mr. Vassiliou.
So is there any concern that there's a lack of competition in rural Manitoba? And not only maybe there's only one brokerage in a small town, all the towns next to it have the same company owning that one brokerage. And I think you alluded to that there's the possibility that these large Vancouver-based companies will start shutting down these rural outlets to save money. And does MPI have a plan in place should that happen? And does MPI see this as a problem that we have to increase competition amongst local brokerages?
Mr. Herblin.
Well, I would first say that MPI is not regulating the brokerage profession. We are working in partnership to try and make sure that together we provide the best service to Manitobans. I would repeat what I mentioned before, is really we are aware and mindful and I would say concerned that we want to ensure that Manitobans in all parts of the province have access to a broker and can transact at that broker location whenever they want to. I think part of the evolution of where we're going is, in addition to providing access to a broker whenever someone would want to interact in person or just picking the phone and talking to a human, is the provision of online services that also will help alleviate maybe some of those constraints. But we are in no way interested in seeing brokers consolidating to the extent whereby locations would reduce and access, especially outside of Winnipeg, access to services would be diminished.
Mr. Sandhu.
Last question is maybe not in the report, but this is related to the, as we know, Manitoba is divided, I think, into 4 zones, the insurance that you can get as Winnipeg, city of Winnipeg, and then the outside the city. When person from such as Thompson or Pa drives into Winnipeg, their children are not allowed to use that vehicle to work or even to school. In case if there's an accident, there's no covers. Is MPI doing any kind of advertisement on this so people are aware of this?
Mr. Herblin.
I would say as a general statement that currently the map is divided in a number of territories, and that has, you know, some history to it, but there's constant discussions with PUB and interveners at PUB whether it makes sense to have the divisions we have and the use codes we have and so on. And so we are currently trying to understand the pros and the cons of the model, and potentially suggest changes that would be in the benefit of the MPI citizen users. Having said that, one of the key role of the broker is to inform their customers about what they are covered for, what they are not covered for, to provide the changes needed whenever there is a change needed. So sometimes it's just a matter of changing from all-purpose to you know, a more casual use of the vehicle, or the other way around. It might be a question of laying off the vehicle for a number of months during the winter times. This is what the MPI staff in the service center and the brokers are expected to provide. Having said that, on the insurance transactions specifically, more than 90% of those transactions are conducted by the brokers. And so it is very much in their responsibility to doing that.
Mr. Sandhu.
This is, I'll probably be forwarding you that MPI, this information that I recently received an email. A person from the PA moved, not moved, his parents came to Winnipeg. Then he drove the vehicle to work and he had an accident and he's not covered for it.
I would have to advise the member that this is about general things in the report, not about specific incidents. So I don't think that question is one that's really part of this committee. Mr. Sandhu.
Is there gonna be any, put this way, any advertisement done reminding people of their rights and how to just to write about people's right on this? So you can.
Mr. Herblin.
Yeah, two aspects to that question. First of all, in terms of territories as such, they are relevant to determine pricing, but the territories as such are not restricting the usage that one can make from a vehicle. More generally, there's a lot to know about MPI, and so each and every year we publish a Autopack guide on our website that is also accessible through the broker. So that is where Manitobans can get all the information that is relevant about the Autopack.
Seeing no further questions, I will now put the question on the report. Shall the annual report of the Manitoba Public Insurance Corporation for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2022 pass?
Pass.
The report is accordingly passed. The hour being 11:01, what is the will of the committee?
Committee rise.
Committee rise.